Hey guys, so it's just Cosmo today, and I wanted to talk to you about the Bitsy engine and the game that I made with it. So obviously I usually use Game Maker for my videos and as my primary game making engine, but I think Bitsy is a really interesting tool, so it's something that is available for free online. It just runs in your browser, so you don't even need to download anything. And as it says, it's a little editor for making little games or worlds. And it's very minimalist and small. There's only so much that you can actually do. Basically, you can just move a character around like this and interact with objects in the game and have dialogue. And you can move between rooms, you can pick up items and even have variables in your scripting. So for example, you could have a particular line of dialogue and change it depending on perhaps how much of an item that you've got. But yeah, it's a very minimalist engine. And you can see that even with the sprites. This is just a 128 by 128 pixel canvas, and the sprites themselves can only be 8 by 8. And while you can have animation, it's limited to 2 frames. And then with the palette for the sprites, basically every room in the game has to adhere to a 3 color palette. And you can change that between rooms, but it just means that, again, you have a lot of limitations on what sort of assets that you can create. And while this might seem quite restrictive, it's actually quite fun to try and push this to its limits and work within those limitations. It often forces a lot of creativity when you have a lot of restrictions like this. And if you're a beginner looking to get into games and some very basic scripting or just game development and level design and pixel art, this is absolutely perfect. So I wanted to make a short game, a short story-based game, and to keep the scope as small as I possibly could and to make it easier for myself, I decided to choose a story that already exists. So I chose the Greek myth, which you might know as the Abduction of Persephone. So this is quite a famous story, and I'll just give you the quick version. It basically begins with Demeter, who is the goddess of basically the harvest and agriculture, but more generally just fertility on Earth. And she was one of the original 12 Olympians and is the sister of Zeus. And then there is Persephone, her daughter, who is the goddess of vegetation and is obviously tied to her mother, but eventually she becomes also the queen of the underworld. So essentially they live together, Demeter and Persephone, in a beautiful world on Mount Olympus. And basically one day Hades, who is the god of the underworld, sees Persephone and basically decides that he wants to marry her. So he abducts Persephone when she is alone and separated from her friends and brings her down to the underworld. And Demeter basically discovers that her daughter is missing, although no one can tell her where she is or who might have taken her. The story can actually be quite long. She actually goes on a little adventure, but the short version is that she's so distraught at the loss of her daughter and at the lack of help that she's getting from the other gods that she throws the earth into a perpetual winter. Basically, she doesn't allow anything to grow. And for the humans at the time, they don't know how to farm. So they can't grow grain by themselves, and there is a huge famine. And as the mortals start to die, they lose faith in the gods to protect them and feed them. This forces the hand of Zeus, who finally agrees to help her and basically orders Hades to release Persephone, which he does do, but he manages to trick Persephone into eating food from the underworld, which for some reason binds her to it. And then, since neither will budge, Demeter is keeping the earth in that barren winter, and Hades has a claim on Persephone as well. So they have to reach a compromise, and it's decided that Persephone will be allowed to return to her mother, but has to return to Hades for several months of the year. In some stories it's half the year, in some stories it's less. And basically, during that time, Demeter becomes filled with sorrow once again at the loss of her daughter, and again makes the earth barren. And that time supposedly is what we now know as winter. And then when her daughter comes back to her, she lets the earth grow again, and we have spring. So the coming of spring is basically associated with Persephone's return to Earth. And I really like this story for a lot of reasons, and primarily I find it really interesting, for one, that Demeter, who is a mother, is the protagonist of this story, and she's probably the most powerful being in this story. And despite having a seemingly humble power over grain, over the harvest and the fertility of earth, she is able to bend even Zeus, the all-powerful, to her will and bring humanity to its knees. And there are actually a lot of stories that are similar to this, where we have a great love, although it's usually a romantic love. It's so powerful it is able to bring back someone from the dead or someone from the underworld. And like I said, I find this quite a compelling story. It's very interesting and short enough basically to represent in a game. It's about more of a journey than mechanics. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about my process. So I'm not a great artist, so I think this game took me about a little over a week to make, and most of my time I think was devoted to doing the pixel art for it. It took me quite a while, and especially the last piece, although I kind of cheated on that one, but I'll talk about that a little bit later. So I literally started off by just making the sprites for some of the characters and assembling some of the rooms. I wanted to keep it quite simple, so it's kind of just set in a forest, which I also always love because so many games and stories do start out in a humble forest, which isn't actually how the Greek myth starts. As I said, they kind of start on Mount Olympus, but I thought this was a fair analogy. And I also have some dryads in my story who can interact with. In the original tale, it's more nymphs from the water that are present, which I also have. And as you can see, I modified the palettes in some places, so where there was water, I made the room blue, and in the areas where the grain grew, I made that a more orange and yellow colour scheme. And it's to create basically a sense of place that's distinct from one another, and to create a different feeling, because again, there's not too much you can do with the tools that you have, so colour is actually going to probably be a big part of how to establish the mood in your game and to influence what the player is feeling as they move through the experience. And another big part of what I used in the game, as you can see already, are the room transitions. So instead of just moving from one room and appearing in the next one without any transition, I've put a kind of sliding effect that you see in some of the older games like Zelda. And again, there's not many options for room transitions. You can basically fade the room in a very simple way, move the rooms, and there is this one interesting kind of wave effect that I use later on. Another thing I found kind of hard to represent in this engine was just which character was speaking, so I had to again make use of the colours and also the text effects. So I basically had Demeter always speaking with full yellow text. I had a lot of the other characters just speaking in white, and they would highlight important bits of information with yellow or whatever the palette was for that room. And as you can see, when I'm describing an action rather than something that someone's saying, I say it without those quotations, and it's in the room color basically. And then some of my god characters, they speak with the wavy text. The most important distinction, of course, was just when Demeter was speaking, who is kind of our protagonist, who is the player, and then whoever that she's talking to. And then the proximity to whatever object she was near hopefully clued the player into who was actually speaking at that time. So I had the start of the game kind of establishing the relationship that Demeter has with her daughter and with the earth, so she kind of has her duties to go off and grow the grain for the humans, while her daughter is sort of playing in the forest and interacting with the dryads and the nymphs. And we also have this flower, the Narcissus flower, which in some versions of the story is what distracted Persephone when Hades takes her. So I do find it quite interesting that I chose to spend quite a lot of time on that first section to set that context up, because a lot of the older stories kind of just summarize that as Demeter and Persephone live together on Mount Olympus happily, and then it kind of fast forwards to the more exciting bit when she actually gets taken. But I really wanted the moment when Persephone is taken to have an effect on the player. So for them to be worried at this point that they'd woken up next to Persephone the previous couple nights and she wasn't there this morning. And now the forest is empty. So kind of setting up the player's expectations, repeating passages a few times, knowing that this means that Persephone has like gone through here today. She's grown the flowers. That's one of the powers that she had as the goddess of vegetation. It was said that the flowers kind of rose even at the side of her beauty. And here I even have so that not only the color change from this room, but of course now there is a river here. And this is actually, I love this part of the story. I didn't mention it before, but there is this water nymph called Cyan who is one of the only characters that tries to help Persephone when Hades comes to steal her. And it's not so much that the others didn't want to help, it was that they didn't see what was happening or they couldn't leave the water. But Cyan does, and she runs over here. She fails to save her and then collapses into a river of tears. And not only is that kind of just a beautiful thing to imagine doing for someone, to give your life and then be so overcome with grief that you literally collapse into a river of tears. But as with a lot of Greek mythology, this is actually tied to a real place. So there is a river Cyan in Sicily, which is said to just be a short river. So you can literally go here and it has this association with the story of the abduction of Persephone. And as I said, a lot of the Greek myths are actually tied to places, especially in Sicily and Italy and Greece. And so back to the game, another thing that I wanted to represent was just kind of the power that Demeter has over the earth. And I've taken a little bit of artistic liberty here and made it a little bit more violent and sudden than what's actually told in the story. So I kind of have her ripping the world apart with that. It's actually just a room transition into another room with a different palette. Whereas in the story, she just doesn't tend to the earth and doesn't allow anything to grow, rather than just making everything wither immediately. But as I said, just because of the limitations on everything, I thought representing Demeter's grief and kind of wrath in this way was a bit more compelling. So most of the exciting parts of my game are represented through the room transitions. Basically everything I do, every change in the game, is just by transitioning to a different room, which is definitely not what I would do in GameMaker. I would have objects being created and deleted, basically. But due to the lightweight nature of the engine and the limitations on it, it kind of encourages a more experimental, even like a messy kind of approach to doing it, because it works and it's very easy to do. And a big thing about this is repeating motifs. So I also have I describe her rage as kind of transforming just as she transforms the world. I find that is always quite a powerful story tool to use, to repeat words or phrases or pictures. And here is another interesting point of the story, actually. Again, there's a lot of intertextuality in the Greek myths and in all stories, because this story has influenced a lot more. But it's said that Demeter, who, again, so overcome by her grief and angry at the nymphs for not protecting her daughter, cursed them to grow scales and talons and, in some accounts, wings to become sirens. And that might not be the classic image of a siren that you're picturing, which are generally beautiful women who entice sailors with their song. In some of the stories, they were more bird-like and kind of similar to the harpies. And in some, there's no distinction between the two. But again, I really love this because it was really unexpected that the sirens, which are such a powerful creature that is in so many other texts, even to this day in a lot of fantasy settings, just that was where they came from. So I loved that, and I thought I had to include that as well. And there is a lot of interesting things about this story. For example, a lot of the other gods aren't actually helping Demeter and don't even see a problem with what Hades has done. And in hindsight, as I thought about the ending of the story, it's actually quite horrific. So I don't know if you could adapt this to the modern day and have viewers be okay with the fact that someone can just abduct someone's daughter and eventually basically, forces that daughter to marry him. It's quite obscene. And the fact that a lot of the gods didn't even help Demeter strikes me as quite odd as well. Although she does find odd help in Hecate, the goddess of magic and spirits, and Helios, the all-seeing sun god. But still, because of everything that this inspired, it's clear that everyone, feels for Demeter and everyone knows that what happened is wrong, and that is inspired by her devotion to her daughter. Perhaps if one was to make up a story of how winter came to be, it would have to be through a story about grief. And maybe what greater grief is there than a parent or a mother who loves their child and has that child taken from them. And and that love is so great that she is willing to kind of burn the earth and see all of the humans die rather than give up on her daughter. So finally, towards the end of the story, so like I said, I was kind of confronted by the fact that just the ending is kind of regressive, I guess. And I didn't want that to be the most important takeaway from the story, the fact that she kind of doesn't fully get her daughter back, and Hades kind of, does get what he wants. Persephone does marry him and becomes queen of the underworld and rules by his side. So I didn't really want to concentrate on that aspect. I wanted to really concentrate on Demeter and more of just the story of how winter came to be, because that's what I love about this story anyway. And I think that's what has inspired a lot of art and adaptations of this story. So I chose to end it on this picture, basically. That moment when Hermes is flying up with Persephone, and the moment where Demeter and Persephone are reunited. And you might recognize this picture because I've based it off of a famous painting by Friedrich Leighton, The Return of Persephone, which is a very kind of beautiful Renaissance romantic style of painting. So you can see they're quite similar. It was quite a struggle to recreate this with pixel art and then to only use 2 colors for it, because I actually compiled this using tiles. So I first kind of created the image, and then I had to square by square put it into the game with the tiles, and that took so long, but I really wanted that moment to be powerful, so I really wanted that to be in it. Presumably there might have been an easier way to embed an image, but like I said, there's something, fun about using just the bare engine and doing what you can with the limited tools. So you can still put together a piece like this without using any plugins or anything. So I didn't actually use any plugins. The only thing I did add to the HTML file was just to play some music, but other than that, I didn't touch anything. So back to what I was saying, I really wanted to end it on this note when they're reunited, because I love this painting and find it very beautiful. It captures a lot of emotion, but it's also quite, an uplifting note to end on, and I didn't want to end on a sad note, even though that's not the end of the story. And I just kind of chose to tell the rest in text. Because something that I've realized in playing games and in making games and something that I'm trying to consider more going forwards, is that what I love about games when I have a lot of nostalgia for a game, or just when I really enjoy playing the game, is the kind of feeling that it gives you, or that it leaves you with, or that a section of the game makes you feel. And as the developer, you have to be really mindful and deliberate in the choices that you make with your assets, with your dialogue, with your music, with every decision that you make with the mechanics, to lead the player to feeling some kind of thing, if that's what you're trying to do. And if you want a moment to hit hard, you have to use the tools available to you to make the player feel what you want. So I wanted to represent this story authentically, but I wanted to leave the player kind of empowered with the knowledge of this story, and also just to be impressed and have a lot of empathy for what Demeter has been feeling all this time. I really wanted the player to feel really happy to be reunited with Persephone. A little bittersweet to know that she would still be leaving each year. I don't really think there's many people who believe in these myths anymore, but they're just beautiful stories, and it gives you something to think about. Perhaps when you're staring out the window on a cold winter's day, perhaps it snows where you are, you might think of Demeter and her grief for the absence of Persephone, and perhaps that the whole world is grieving with her.